History is moving again, and this time Eala is not asking the tennis world for permission to belong. She is taking her place by force. Elina Svitolina walked onto the court in Washington carrying everything that normally makes a young challenger hesitate. Experience, reputation, a top-level ranking. Years of surviving the most brutal pressure the tour can create. She had already seen nearly every kind of opponent, every tactical adjustment, every emotional storm. And then Eala dismantled the script. 6-3, 6-4, straight sets, no escape route. No miraculous comeback for the established star. No moment when the young Filipina suddenly remembered that she was supposed to be the outsider. Eala played as though the reputation on the other side of the net did not exist. She attacked with the freedom of somebody who had already crossed the invisible line separating promising talent from genuine danger. She moved Svitolina, she absorbed pressure. She redirected pace, and whenever the match threatened to tighten, she refused to shrink. That is what made this victory feel bigger than another result on a tournament scoreboard. Because Washington was becoming something far more dangerous. It was becoming evidence that Miami had not been a miracle. Evidence that Berlin had not been an accident. Evidence that Wimbledon had not simply been one magical explosion of confidence. Eala was building a pattern. And patterns are what the elite notice. The official result was ruthless. Eala defeated the second seed in 1 hour and 34 minutes, booking her place in the Washington semifinals and collecting another victory over a top 10 opponent during a season that had already transformed her reputation. But the score alone cannot explain why the moment carried so much electricity. For months, Eala had been knocking on doors that young players are usually expected to approach carefully. She did not knock. She kicked them open. She had already stunned Iga Swiatek on one of the greatest stages in the sport. She had already forced the tennis world to reconsider how high her ceiling might actually be. She had already walked onto center court at Wimbledon with the hopes of the Philippines following every swing of her racket. And sitting in the royal box during Eala's Wimbledon battle with Jasmine Paolini was Roger Federer. That part is real. The 8-time Wimbledon champion watched as Eala fought Paolini across 3 demanding sets on center court, a match that pushed the Italian deep into a deciding set before experience finally prevailed. Federer's presence became part of the atmosphere surrounding that match, so much so that Paolini later spoke openly about the nerves of competing while one of her idols watched from above. Think about what that means. A player who once represented a distant dream for millions of young athletes was now sitting only meters away, while Eala competed on center court, not in a junior exhibition, not in a ceremonial appearance, not in some distant qualifying court hidden from the spotlight. Center court, Wimbledon. The stage where Federer built so much of his own legend, and Eala belonged there. That is why what happened against Svitolina in Washington matters so much. Because the story did not end when Wimbledon ended. There was no collapse back into obscurity, no long emotional hangover, no comfortable retreat into the idea that reaching the second week of a Grand Slam was already enough. Eala wanted more, and Svitolina discovered exactly how hungry she had become. From the opening exchanges, there was something almost defiant about the way Eala competed. Her left-handed patterns created uncomfortable geometry. Her willingness to attack early prevented Svitolina from settling into the long, patient exchanges where experience could become a weapon. Every time Svitolina looked ready to establish control, Eala disrupted the rhythm. Every time the veteran tried to make the match physical, Eala answered. Every time pressure arrived, the young Filipina seemed to become more certain rather than less. That is the transformation that should terrify the rest of the tour. Talent is common at this level, fearlessness is rarer. Fearlessness combined with evidence is something else entirely. Once a player has defeated enough champions, the mythology disappears, the names stop looking enormous. The rankings stop feeling sacred, the history across the net becomes information rather than intimidation. And Eala is beginning to play like somebody who understands that difference. Svitolina was not merely another opponent. She had spent years competing deep in the biggest tournaments in tennis. She knew how to change pace. She knew how to extend rallies until impatience destroyed younger players. She knew how to turn a single loose game into an emotional collapse, but Eala did not give her the collapse. Instead, she gave her pressure, again, and again, and again. By the time the final stages arrived, the most striking image was not wild celebration. It was control. The kind of control that says the player expects to be here. The kind of control that transforms an upset into a warning. And this was not even Eala's first victory over Svitolina during the season. She had also beaten the Ukrainian in Berlin, again by 6-3, 6-4. Washington therefore carried another layer of psychological weight. Svitolina knew what Eala could do. She had experienced the patterns before. She had time to prepare for them, and Eala still beat her. Same score. Different surface, different city. Same message. That is when the conversation around a player begins to change. The first major upset creates headlines. The second creates curiosity. The third creates belief. But once the same elite opponents begin falling repeatedly, coaches stop asking whether the youngster can survive at this level. They start asking how to stop her, and those are two completely different questions. Now we have to address the name that makes this story explode beyond Washington. Roger Federer. There is an important distinction that cannot be ignored. There is no verified public statement from Federer specifically reacting to Eala's Washington victory over Svitolina that can responsibly be presented as a direct quote. And there is no need to invent one, because the real connection is already powerful enough. Federer had watched Eala compete on center court only weeks earlier. He had seen with his own eyes the young Filipina standing inside the sport's most famous arena, trading blows with an established Grand Slam finalist hand refusing to disappear. So imagine the significance of what followed. The player Federer had watched at Wimbledon did not fade after leaving London. She accelerated. Washington became a demolition ground for reputations. Olympic champion Zhang Qinwen fell. Defending Washington champion Leylah Fernandez fell. Svitolina fell. Then four-time Grand Slam champion Naomi Osaka fell. And eventually Jessica Pegula fell as Eala completed the run and became the first woman from the Philippines to win a tour-level singles title. That is not hype anymore, that is a resume. That is a trail of champions, and it completely changes the meaning of Federer having watched her at Wimbledon. At the time, Eala was a rising player enjoying a historic Grand Slam run. Only weeks later, she had become a tour champion. The outsider was no longer standing outside the gates, she was inside the castle taking trophies. And perhaps the most frightening part for everybody else is how quickly her expectations appear to be changing. There was a time when simply reaching these stages represented history for Philippine tennis. Now Eala walks into them carrying the expectation that she can win. There was a time when drawing a top 10 player meant surviving an enormous challenge. Now those opponents are becoming names on a growing list. There was a time when sharing a center court atmosphere with Roger Federer in a royal box might have felt like the kind of memory a young player would treasure forever. Now it feels like something else, a preview. A glimpse of a player being introduced to the rooms where tennis royalty gathers before she has even reached the limits of what she might become. And across the Philippines, that transformation carries an emotional weight that rankings cannot measure. Every victory sends another shockwave through a country that has waited generations for a tennis player capable of making these stages feel familiar. Every Filipino flag in the stands becomes part of the story. Every roar after match point becomes louder because supporters understand that they are watching barriers collapse in real time. Eala is not simply collecting victories for herself. She is changing what young players thousands of miles away believe is possible. That is why the Svitolina victory feels so important, not because one famous name lost, but because Alexander Eala is beginning to make famous names losing to her look normal. And once that happens, the entire balance of fear changes. The next established champion who sees Eala's name beside hers in the draw will not see an ambitious youngster hoping for an upset, she will see Swiatek. She will see Svitolina, she will see Osaka, she will see Pegula. She will see the evidence, and somewhere behind all of those results sits another unforgettable image. Roger Federer in the royal box at Wimbledon. Watching, observing, seeing Alexander Eala compete on the court where he once ruled. The tennis world spent years wondering who the next generation would be. Alexander Eala is no longer waiting for that generation to arrive, she is becoming part of it. And after Washington, after Svitolina, after another champion was forced to watch the young Filipino walk away victorious, one reality is becoming impossible to ignore. This story is no longer about whether Alexander Eala can shock the tennis world. The real question is how many times she can do it before everyone finally stops calling it a shock. Because that is the uncomfortable truth now. At some point, surprise becomes expectation. At some point, the giant killing stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like hierarchy being rewritten. And Alexander Eala is moving dangerously close to that point. Look at the way the story has evolved. At first, every major victory came wrapped in disbelief. Commentators searched for explanations, opponents talked about difficult conditions, unusual rhythms, awkward left-handed patterns, the pressure of the moment. People tried to understand how a player carrying so little tour experience could look so comfortable against women who had spent years living inside the top levels of professional tennis. But explanation can only protect the old order for so long. Eventually, results become the explanation, and the results are screaming. Eala is fast enough to defend, aggressive enough to attack, patient enough to construct, fearless enough to finish, but the most dangerous up-and may be something that never appears on the statistics sheet. She is learning how to believe before the scoreboard gives her permission. Against Svitolina, that belief was everywhere. You could feel it when Eala stepped inside the baseline instead of drifting backward. You could feel it when she trusted her forehand under pressure. You could feel it when Svitolina tried to drag her into another grinding exchange and Eala refused to surrender the initiative. This was not reckless tennis, it was controlled defiance. There is a difference. Reckless players swing because they are afraid of what happens if the rally continues. Fearless players swing because they know exactly what they want the rally to become. Eala increasingly looks like the second kind. And that is where the comparison with the greatest competitors begins to become fascinating. Roger Federer built his career on making impossible tennis look inevitable. Serena Williams built hers on making opponents feel that even their best level might not be enough. Rafael Nadal could turn one defensive point into an emotional earthquake. Novak Djokovic could survive a moment that should have broken him and somehow emerge stronger on the other side. Alexander Eala is not being placed beside those legends because she has matched their careers. That would be absurd. She is being discussed in the same emotional language because young players announce themselves through moments that make people stop watching casually. Moments when you lean toward the screen, moments when you ask yourself what exactly you are seeing. Moments when the old expectations suddenly feel outdated. Federer once had those moments, Serena had them, Nadal had them. Every legend begins with a period when the tennis world is trying to decide whether the electricity is temporary. And Eala is forcing that question now. How temporary is this? How many more elite opponents must fall before the answer becomes obvious? How many more stadiums must fill with Filipino flags before tournament organizers understand that wherever she goes, an entire community is coming with her? How many more times must she walk into a match as the supposedly less experienced player and leave as the one everybody remembers? Washington gave another answer. Svitolina arrived with the resume, Eala left with the victory. And the psychological meaning of beating the same elite opponent twice cannot be overstated. The first time, perhaps the established player can call it surprise. Maybe the scouting was incomplete. Maybe the patterns were unfamiliar. Maybe the timing was unusual, but the second time. Now both sides know. Now there are no secrets. Now Svitolina understands where the left-handed serve is trying to pull her. She understands how quickly Eala can change direction. She understands that the young Filipino will attack a short ball without hesitation. She understands the danger. And knowing did not save her. That is what turns a result into a warning. Because the rest of the tour is watching tape too. Coaches are building notebooks. Analysts are charting tendencies. Opponents are studying return positions, preferred patterns, pressure points, emotional habits. The surprise advantage begins disappearing, and yet Eala keeps winning. That is usually the moment when genuine contenders reveal themselves. When everybody has film, when everybody has a plan. When nobody is underestimating you anymore. Can you still impose yourself? Against Svitolina, Eala did. And the deeper this run went, the greater the financial stakes became. Every round meant more ranking points, every victory meant a larger prize check. Every television appearance meant more visibility. Every packed section of Filipino supporters made sponsors understand something powerful. Alexander Eala does not merely bring tennis ability, she brings attention. She brings identity, she brings a market that has been waiting for somebody to carry his flag into the center of the global tennis conversation. That can change a career. Prize money rewards what happens this week. Sponsorship can reward what a player represents for years, and Eala represents something rare. A nation experiencing elite tennis history through one athlete in real time. That is why the crowd matters so much. Listen to what happens when she wins a long rally. It does not sound like ordinary applause. There is relief inside it. There is pride inside it. There is the sound of people who understand that they are not simply cheering for another professional athlete. They are cheering for proof that a Filipino player can stand across from the biggest names in women's tennis and refuse to bow. Proof that a child watching from Manila, Cebu, Davao, or anywhere else does not have to treat the highest levels of the sport as something belonging only to other countries. That emotional force travels with Eala, and opponents can feel it. One Filipino flag becomes 10. 10 become hundreds, the chants become louder. The television cameras find families crying after match point, social media explodes. Suddenly a match that might have been treated as a routine quarterfinal becomes something closer to a national event. That is pressure, not only for Eala, for the woman across the net. Because when a crowd begins believing in an underdog, every point becomes heavier. A break point is not merely a break point, it becomes an invitation for chaos. A missed first serve becomes a roar, a double fault becomes oxygen for the challenger. One spectacular passing shot can transform an arena. Eala understands how to feed that energy. She does not need theatrical gestures after every point. Her tennis does the talking. A clenched fist, a sharp look toward her team. A quick turn back toward the baseline. Then another point. That rhythm is devastating because it tells the opponent that the celebration can wait. The work is not finished. And that mentality is exactly why the image of Federer watching her at Wimbledon continues to carry such symbolic weight. Federer knew better than almost anyone what it meant to turn elegance into pressure. He understood that domination does not always need to look violent. Sometimes the most intimidating player is the one who appears completely calm while dismantling you. Eala is developing her own version of that emotional control, not Federer's style. Not Federer's game, her own, but the principle is recognizable. The scoreboard can be screaming while the face remains composed. The stadium can be exploding while the next point still requires clarity. The opponent can carry a famous name while the ball arriving across the net remains only a ball that must be struck. That is maturity, and for a young player, maturity becomes dangerous when it arrives alongside ambition. Because Eala does not appear satisfied with becoming a historic Filipino tennis player. She appears increasingly interested in becoming a historic tennis player who happens to be Filipino. There is a massive difference. The first goal measures her against the past of one nation. The second measures her against everybody. And perhaps that is why every victory now seems to open another question instead of closing the story. Can she break deeper into the world rankings? Can she become a seeded player at the biggest tournaments? Can she reach the second week of Grand Slams regularly? Can she contend for titles against fields filled with major champions? Can she survive when expectations reverse and she becomes the favorite? Those are the questions that come after breakthrough. And they are harder than the questions that came before. It is one thing to chase, another thing entirely to be chased. When you are the outsider, you can swing freely. When everybody knows your name, opponents arrive desperate to make their own statement against you. They celebrate harder, they scout longer. They prepare more specifically. Every player wants to be the one who stops the run. The future is coming for Eala. Maybe it has already arrived, and that is why what happened with Svitolina carries so much importance. Eala was not facing an opponent unaware of her danger. She was facing somebody who already knew, somebody who had already lost to her, somebody who had every reason to arrive prepared for revenge. And Eala still walked away with the same straight set score, 6-3, 6-4. Almost as though the first victory had not been an upset at all. Almost as though it had been a preview. Now imagine what that does to the locker room conversation. Players notice patterns long before the public does. They know who is striking the ball cleanly in practice. They know who is carrying confidence from tournament to tournament. They know who has become uncomfortable to draw early. And Eala is becoming exactly that kind of name, the dangerous unseeded player. The player nobody wants near their section. The player whose ranking may still suggest vulnerability, while her recent results suggest something completely different. Those players can tear tournaments apart. And Eala is doing more than tearing through draws. She is changing the emotional expectation around Philippine tennis. Before her, history often sounded distant. Now it arrives every week, a new ranking milestone. Another top opponent defeated. Another stadium filled with flags, another headline traveling across continents. Another generation of children hearing her name. That is how sporting cultures change, not through one speech. Not through one advertising campaign. Through repetition, victory after victory. Image after image. Moment after moment, until the extraordinary begins to feel normal. And there is nothing normal about what Alexander Eala is doing. Not yet, but that may be exactly where this is going. A future where seeing her beat a major champion does not trigger disbelief. A future where seeing her deep in a major draw is expected. A future where the greats of the sport are no longer watching a fascinating young outsider. They are watching a contender. And that is why the Federer connection continues to resonate even without pretending there is some dramatic quotation that never existed. The power is in the image itself, one of the greatest players the sport has ever known sitting inside Wimbledon's royal box. Alexander Eala competing below, a young player from the Philippines stepping onto the most sacred grass court in tennis. then leaving London and continuing to win. Continuing to climb, continuing to take down established names. Continuing to prove that center court was not a destination. It was an introduction, because Washington was waiting. Svitolina was waiting. And Eala arrived with something more dangerous than momentum. She arrived with proof that she could do this again. And proof changes everything. Once a player proves she can defeat the same elite opponent more than once, the conversation is no longer about potential. It becomes about permanence. Can Alexandra Eala stay here? Can she turn this eruption into a standard? Can she build a career where defeating players like Elina Svitolina is not the greatest night of the season, but simply another important step towards something even larger? That is the challenge now. Because the higher Eala climbs, the smaller the margin becomes. At the top of professional tennis, everybody can strike the ball. Everybody can punish a short second serve. Everybody can defend for one more shot. Everybody has survived pressure. The separation happens in the smallest places. One return at 30 all. One decision on break point. One forehand taken early instead of late. One moment when the crowd becomes deafening and the mind must become silent. That is where champions are built. And against Svitolina, Eala kept winning those moments. Not all of them. Nobody does. But enough. Enough to keep the match moving in her direction. Enough to prevent the veteran from building momentum. Enough to make every attempted comeback feel temporary. Enough to create the strangest feeling of all, control. The young outsider had control. That is what people remember, not simply that she won, but that she looked as though she knew why she was winning. There was structure behind it, purpose behind it. A clear willingness to dictate rather than survive. And that changes how every future opponent must prepare. They cannot simply wait for Eala to become nervous. They cannot assume experience will eventually rescue them. They cannot expect the moment to become too large, because the evidence says otherwise. The bigger the stage becomes, the more alive she seems to become. Miami, Berlin, Wimbledon, Washington, different cities, different surfaces, different opponents, same refusal to be intimidated. That is the thread connecting everything. And somewhere inside that thread sits one of the most powerful forces in sport. Memory. Every athlete carries memory onto the court. Svitolina carried the memory of losing to Eala before. Eala carried the memory of beating her. Those memories are not equal. For the veteran, the previous defeat creates questions. For the younger player, it creates certainty. I have done this. I know what this feels like. I know what happens when I stay aggressive. I know I can survive for pressure. I know I can close. That internal conversation can become more powerful than anything a coach says from the box. And once Eala established herself early in Washington, those memories must have become louder. For Svitolina, every successful Eala pattern was a reminder. For Eala, every successful pattern was confirmation. That is how matches begin slipping psychologically before the final score makes it obvious. The scoreboard may say one break, the mind may feel something much larger. And when Eala reached the final stretch, she did not need to create a theatrical ending. She needed discipline, hold the line, trust the patterns. Keep the feet moving, do not admire the finish before the final ball lands. That is one of the most difficult lessons in tennis. Young players often see the finish line and begin thinking about the celebration. They imagine the handshake, they imagine the headline, they imagine the ranking points. And suddenly the body tightens, the arm slows. The opponent senses hesitation. A match that seemed finished becomes alive again. Eala avoided that trap. She kept competing, point after point, until there were no points left. Then came a handshake, the confirmation. Another elite opponent defeated. Another piece of history written. Another night when Filipino supporters could look at the screen and say the same thing, she did it again. Not once, again. That word carries enormous power. Again means repeatability. Again means the first time was not luck. Again means the opponent had information and still could not find the answer. Again means the tour has a problem, and if there is one thing the greatest players in history understood, it was the value of making excellence repeatable. Roger Federer did not become Roger Federer because of one beautiful tournament. Serena Williams did not become Serena Williams because of one overpowering performance. Rafael Nadal did not become Rafael Nadal because of one impossible comeback. Greatness is repetition under changing conditions. Different opponent, different weather, different court, different pressure, same standard. That is the mountain Eala is beginning to climb. She is nowhere near the summit yet, but for the first time, the path is visible. And that may be what makes this chapter so exciting. The story is not complete enough to feel comfortable. There are still questions everywhere. There will be losses. There will be difficult draws. There will be weeks when the timing disappears. There will be opponents who expose weaknesses. There will be moments when expectations become heavier than underdog freedom. Every rising player experiences that. The test is what happens next. Does the player panic? Does she reinvent everything after one bad result? Does she begin listening to every voice around her? Or does she keep building patiently on the identity that brought her here? Eala's identity is becoming clearer: aggression without apology, movement without fear, national pride without being consumed by it, ambition without pretending the journey is finished. That last part matters, because the most dangerous young athletes are not the ones celebrating what they have already achieved. They are the ones irritated by how much remains. The ones who see a semifinal and immediately think about the final. The ones who see a ranking milestone and immediately look at the next group above them. The ones who defeat a champion and begin thinking about the next champion. That hunger appears to be growing inside Eala, and when hunger meets evidence, careers can accelerate very quickly. The tennis calendar does not wait. There is always another tournament, another draw, another locker room, another opponent studying your previous match. The celebration lasts one night, then the sport demands proof again. That relentless cycle can destroy confidence, or it can sharpen it. For Eala, every new challenge now arrives with a foundation she did not have before. She knows she can defeat a top 10 player. She knows she can do it more than once. She knows she can compete on center court. She knows she can carry the pressure of an entire country watching. She knows she can walk into an arena where the other player owns the larger reputation and walk out owning the moment. Those experiences cannot be taken away. Rankings move, prize money gets spent, headlines disappear. Experience stays, and that is why the greatest reward from Washington may not even have been the points or the money. It may have been another layer of belief. The kind that cannot be manufactured in practice. You earn it by closing matches, by surviving pressure, by looking across the net at somebody you once watched on television and realizing she is not a symbol anymore. She is an opponent. That transition is one of the great psychological rites of passage in professional sport. At first, the stars feel distant. Then you share a locker room. Then you practice beside them. Then you draw them. Then you defeat one. Then another. And eventually you stop seeing yourself as the visitor. You become part of the landscape. Alexander Eala is entering that stage now. The tour knows the name. The crowds know the name. The commentators know the name. The champions know the name. And when the greatest legends of tennis are sitting in the stands while you compete on the biggest courts, the symbolic distance disappears even faster. That is why Federer's presence at Wimbledon resonates so deeply. It represents recognition without needing a speech. A bridge between generations without needing an exaggerated quote. One era sitting above center court, another fighting below. Federer had once been the young player attempting to break through established names. He had once stood opposite champions and tried to prove that reputation could be challenged. He knew what it meant to arrive before the tennis world had fully decided what you would become. That is part of every great career. There is a period when history has not yet chosen its language. Promising, dangerous, breakthrough, contender, champion, legend. Those words arrive one at a time. And Alexander Eala is moving through them faster than many expected, but she cannot skip stages. Nobody can. That is what makes the next part more compelling than the last. Now comes the burden of being known. The scouting becomes sharper, the expectations become louder. The interviews become more frequent. The sponsorship attention grows, every defeat becomes a discussion. Every victory creates another prediction. The world starts trying to tell the young player who she is before she has finished discovering it herself. That pressure can become enormous, especially when millions of supporters see every result as part of national history. Eala will need protection from the nose, not isolation, clarity. The ability to understand that admiration can become pressure if you begin playing to satisfy it. The ability to feel Filipino pride without carrying every Filipino dream into every service game. The ability to remember that a tennis match is still one ball, one point, one decision at a time. That simplicity is often what saves champions. The world makes everything huge. The player must make everything small. See the ball. Move the feet. Choose the target. Commit, repeat. That is where freedom lives. And against Svitolina, Eala found that freedom. The scoreline may look simple when written down, 6-3, 6-4. But behind those words sits years of training, years away from home. Thousands of practice sessions nobody watched, Travel, sacrifice, defeat, doubt, junior tournaments, qualifying matches. Matches where hardly anybody knew her name. Matches where she had to believe before the crowd did. All of that travels into one result. That is why sporting breakthroughs feel sudden from the outside and inevitable from the inside. The public sees the explosion, the athlete remembers the fuse. And Eala's fuse has been burning for years. Now the world is finally seeing the fire. For Philippine tennis, that fire changes the imagination. The next generation no longer has to create a picture from nothing. There is a reference point. There is someone who has walked onto center court. Someone who has defeated major champions. Someone who has faced top 10 opposition and refused to become smaller. Someone whose name appears beside the biggest names in the sport. That matters more than any single ranking. Because rankings measure one player, role models multiply players. Somewhere right now, a young child holding a racket is watching Alexander Eala and learning a different definition of possibility. That child does not need to understand ranking points. Does not need to understand tournament categories. Does not need to understand sponsorship valuations. The message is simpler. Someone from here can belong there. That belief can change an entire sporting culture. And that is how one athlete's breakthrough becomes larger than one athlete. The victories create headlines. The representation creates legacy. Eala is only beginning to understand what that legacy might become. Because there are still so many pages unwritten. Grand Slam nights, possible finals, possible trophies. Possible defeats that teach more than victories. Possible rivalries that could define an era. Possible moments when she walks onto a major court not as the surprise attraction, but as the player everyone came to see. That future is not guaranteed. Nothing in tennis is. That uncertainty is exactly why people watch. But one thing is already clear. Alexander Eala has forced herself into the conversation, not through marketing. Not through fantasy. Through results. Through courage. Through repetition. Through 6-3, 6-4 against Elina Svitolina. Through refusing to respect the invisible boundaries that once separated her from the elite. And when the final point ended in Washington, the significance extended far beyond one match. Another barrier had fallen, another champion had been silenced. Another piece of evidence had been added to the case. The case that Alexander Eala is not waiting for the future of women's tennis, she is trying to seize it. So remember the image, the Filipino flags, the clenched fist. The controlled walk toward the net, Svitolina on the other side, knowing exactly what had happened. A young player who had already beaten her once doing it again. And beyond Washington, another image, Roger Federer watching from the royal box at Wimbledon as Eala fought on center court. No invented quote is required. No manufactured reaction is necessary. The symbolism is powerful enough. One legend had a front row view of a player whose story was accelerating before the world's eyes. And since that afternoon, Alexander Eala has only given the tennis world more reasons to keep watching. More reasons to believe, more reasons to wonder how far this can go. The rankings will change, the opponents will change. The pressure will change. But the question following Eala into every arena is becoming louder. Who is going to stop her next? Because the underdog is disappearing. The outsider is disappearing. The novelty is disappearing. What remains is a competitor. A dangerous one, a fearless one. A player carrying the hopes of a nation while building an identity that belongs entirely to her. Alexander Eala has already made history. But history is no longer enough. Now she wants territory. Now she wants titles. Now she wants the biggest courts, the biggest opponents, the biggest moments. And after what happened to Elina Svitolina, nobody should laugh at that ambition. Nobody should dismiss it. Nobody should look at Alexander Eala across the net and see only a young player from the Philippines. They should see the victories. They should see the belief. They should see the crowd rising behind her. They should see the champions who already fell. And they should understand one final truth. Alexander Eala is no longer arriving, she is here.